So thank you for joining this webinar today. It's so exciting to see so many people here. And thank you, Leah, for the warm introduction. I am calling in today from Squamish, BC, the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish peoples, where I have the privilege to live, work, and play. And I'm also excited to share the results of a project I've had the honor of collaborating on with the National Collaborating Center on Environmental Health over the past year, looking specifically at how best to manage tick-related risks in outdoor environments. And so, let's go here. And so we'll dive just straight in. And the reason we're here and the reason this project even exists is because ticks are a growing public health concern. And that's because they can be found in many environments across Canada. They can infect pathogens, they can infect humans with pathogens causing illness. And due to a combination of climate change, animal migration, deforestation, and land use changes leading to urbanization, they can survive and thrive across Canada, and their range is actually expanding into new environments. So the overarching question for this project was, how can we design and manage outdoor environments, specifically parks, recreational areas, and residential properties to reduce tick-related risks? And we did this through three sets of evidence reviews, as well as using that information to create a designed document for easy access. So the first evidence review gathered and synthesized information on public health risks associated with tick exposure across Canada. The second looked at the impact of climate change and land use changes on tick-related risks in Canada. The third looked at environmental management strategies to reduce tick populations. And then, as I mentioned, the information from these three reviews were then combined to create a designed document for quick access and display to really answer the question, how can we design and manage environments to reduce the risk of tick encounters? So to start off, I have a poll question for you, and that is, what is your field of practice and or profession? And I'll just give a few minutes for people to answer that. Great, so mostly public health folks, some parks and recreation and landscape design and academia. And for all you public health folks, I encourage you to chat with your friends in parks and recreation, landscape design and management, and to share what you learned through this webinar today. So I'm just going to keep going and looking at the first evidence review. And this was a synthesis of 92 literature sources, mostly scholarly research, but also gray literature, primarily restricted to the years 2000 onwards. Having said that, though, we did include seminal pieces from earlier years and an emphasis on Canada where possible. And again, this is not perfect because a lot of the literature with regards to ticks and tick-borne pathogens is from the United States, but where possible, we did focus on Canada, and there is a growing body of literature here. So just so we're all on the same page, we're going to look at the tick life cycle and the habitats. So ticks are small arthropods. They're slow moving. Their bodies have a flat teardrop shape, and they have some distinct life stages. So once from an egg, they hatch, they go into a larvae, a nymph, and an adult. And to go from each of these, to transition from each of these stages, they need to have a blood meal, and they can feed on mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. And when they feed, they become engorged, and you can see on the slide the engorged state. And what's really important here is their size, and you can see the ruler there, and some people do really well with the ruler, but just to give you a context of the size, an unengorged larvae is the size of a grain of sand, an unengorged nymph is the size of a poppy seed, and an unengorged adult is the size of an apple seed. And so these are really small. We're talking with really small, and when they become engorged, they do grow in size and they become an opaque gray color. And so the next question is, what environments are ticks commonly found in across Canada? And just take a moment to answer the poll. Great, and we're seeing the results coming in. So tall grasses, shrubs, leaf litter, forest, beaches, as well as backyard. And ticks can be found in all these locations. In beaches, we tend to find them in the shrubs right next to the beach, but we'll go into this in more depth in a minute. So in Canada, there are over 40 tick species of concern. And the primary ones that we're concerned about in the context of risk to humans are the Ixodes scapularis and the Ixodes pacificus, otherwise known as the black-legged tick and the western black-legged tick. And the Ixodes scapularis is found east of the Rocky Mountains, the Ixodes pacificus is found west of the Rocky Mountains, and both of these ticks prefer high moisture areas, and they're often found in leaf litter and under forest canopies. So really that place where they can be protected, they can be a little bit moist, but still have a host to feed on. There are also 3 other vectors of concern in Canada, the next 2 being the Dermacentor variabilis and the Dermacentor andersoni. The variabilis is found in eastern Canada primarily, and the andersoni is found in western Canada. And the Dermacentor ticks prefer drier environments. So these are the ticks we often find in the tall grasses and in the shrubs. And lastly, we have the Amyloba americanum, and this tick, the Lone Star tick, and this tick can be found Canada-wide, although it is predominantly concentrated in southern Ontario. And this tick also is found in wooded areas and leaf litter. So really a combination of environments is what we're seeing. And I will note that this typical range that's presented in this table is a representation of data available as of 2023, and surveillance is limited in many areas. And so this information could change, and it could be an underrepresentation of ticks in some particular areas where we may not have research or surveillance efforts. And so when we think about these habitat preferences, how does that translate into landscapes that humans interact with? So deciduous habitats contain trees with leaves that fall off annually and create leaf litter on the forest floor. So as a result of these increased leaf litter, deciduous woodlands appear to carry a greater risk of exposure to ticks. There's also tree trunks and fallen logs, which help provide this suitable habitat. Coniferous forests are those with evergreen trees, cones, and needles, and these are the trees that stay green year-round. These also present a risk because they also sometimes have leaf litter, they have fallen logs, and they often actually have a deciduous understory. So again, this is also a potential risk for places to find ticks. And it's also important to remember that regardless of the type of vegetation, ticks can also exist in small patches of forests, and those include small patches near residential areas in leaf litter, as well as growing low-growing vegetation along forest ecotones. And forest ecotones, you'll hear me talk about over and over again, and this is the transition zone between a forested area and a non-forested area. And this transition is where we do find a lot of tick populations, and this transition is also where people tend to recreate along trails and where they are most likely to be exposed to tick encounters. And lastly, for everyone that said beach, I want to say absolutely, we are seeing ticks being discovered in new landscapes because of climate change, and new research shows that ticks were found in coastal shrubs of California where they did test positive for Borrelia. And so this really highlights the need to remain aware of your surroundings and also the risk of tick bites and tick-borne infections when you are recreating outdoors. And so then when we think about, okay, there's the ticks, and then they can carry pathogens that can cause human illness. And when we look at the list, they're mostly bacterial, but also parasitic and viral. And what's really interesting is that when we look at this list, the main concerns in Canada at the moment are Borrelia burgdorferi, Anaplasma phagocytophilium, as well as Babesia. But what's interesting, if you look at the second column from the right, you'll see that not all these pathogens are actually nationally reportable. And so this estimated incidence is sometimes based off surveillance, sometimes imperfect surveillance, sometimes based on research, sometimes it's estimated based off data in the United States. And so what we know is that we see this in Canada, but we don't have a understanding of the true impact of infection because this is likely underreported. And so this really highlights the magnitude of the public health concern and the importance of understanding the challenges and how best to proceed. And with regards to tick-borne pathogens and infections, early diagnosis and prompt treatment are key. And there are some challenges, and primarily it's that tick-borne infections are non-specific and that individuals can actually be infected with more than one infection. And to add to that, most people are either A, unfamiliar with the risks, or B, are traveling from somewhere where they may not know about ticks or tick-borne pathogens and coming to a place in Canada where it's quite common and not know what they're seeing or not know that this could be a risk. And then there are also populations at risk of complications, primarily immunocompromised individuals and older adults, but we also want to consider pregnancy and chest-feeding individuals because there's limited treatment options for those people, which can put them at a risk of complications. But who's at risk? So who are the people that are being exposed to ticks and tick bites? So the risk of human exposure is directly proportional to the amount of time spent outdoors in tick habitats. And again, tick habitats are the tall grass, the brush, the shrubs, the leaf litter. And the amount of time spent outdoors, research shows that the people that spend the most time outdoors in Canada are children ages 5 to 14, adults ages 55 to 79, and males. And I just want to acknowledge here that this is what the research says and perhaps not reflective of your lived experience or how you spend time outdoors. And so then the question becomes, well, what activities increase risk? And so we can kind of break it up into different categories. We can think about it in the context of recreational activities such as hiking, fishing, biking, camping, all the activities that would have you engaging with your environment and kind of like either bushwhacking or getting out there. We can think about daily activities such as things that you might not necessarily think might increase your exposure to ticks, such as gardening, walking your dog, playing outside. And then there are occupational activities such as landscaping or tree planting or being an arborist. And it's important to note that there's a seasonal component to this and that the risk of tick exposure is greatest when nymph ticks are active between roughly May and July, and again in the fall when the adult ticks become active, which is September to November. But having said that, different tick vectors have varying life cycles, and these life cycles can change with temperature and different climatic variables. So the seasonal aspect, we're likely going to see a change. Ticks can also survive winter months by being insulated under tree litter, brush, and snow. So again, the seasonality is important, but we also need to know that seasonality can quickly change based on our climatic variables. So what can you do as an individual? And the best thing you can do to minimize your own risk is to take action. And this action can either be outdoors when you're recreating or out in the environment, or indoors when you're back in home or wherever you are staying. And so outdoors, really the key features are you can avoid high risk areas, you can avoid areas with high grass and or leaf litter, and you can walk on clear trails so that you can manage how you interact with your environment. You can wear light colored clothing, and you can tuck your shirt into your pants and your pants into your socks, and wear closed-toed shoes. And this really just helps you be able to do tick checks and check to see if there's any ticks crawling on you. You can also apply insect repellents and or wear permethrin treated clothing. So that's outdoor actions you can take. When you return indoors, there are also actions you can take. For example, you can check your clothing and your gear for unattached ticks. One of the most effective methods is to take your clothes, change out of them, and put them straight into the dryer for at least 10 minutes because that kills ticks. You can take a shower or bath to rinse unattached ticks, and that also allows you to check yourself as well as pets and or children. And you really want to pay close attention to your hairline, to behind your ears, and then the dark, moist places. So your waist, your belly button, between your legs, and behind your knees. And a mirror in this case is often helpful. And if you do find a tick that's attached, the key is to remove it promptly with a tweezer, and then to keep it in a jar, and you can seek professional advice to see whether it should be sent in for testing. And so these actions have been shown to reduce individual risk of tick encounters and tick bites. So moving on, another question for you. Have you personally taken action to minimize your risk of tick encounters? Wonderful. So it looks like just over 80% have taken action, which is great. I know I always smile when I see someone hiking with their pants tucked into their socks, and it just makes me happy that they're taking action against tick encounters. So moving on, we're going to move to the next evidence review, which is looking at the impact of climate change and land use on tick-related risks. And when we look at climate change, there's really 4 direct variables that we're considering: temperature, humidity, precipitation, and extreme weather events. And when we look at temperature, what we see is that increasing temperatures, especially in temperate and cold environments, can lead to faster maturation of nymph ticks, leading to shorter life cycles, which leads to increased tick abundance and a longer duration of tick activity. These higher temperatures also increase the number of days per year and the number of hours per day that ticks can seek and acquire a host. And so as temperatures increased, this is what is contributing to the northward expansion of tick species into new environments. On the flip side, we see that rising temperatures in arid environments can actually reduce tick activity through increased mortality and desiccation. When we look at humidity, areas with consistent high humidity allow for prolonged tick activity on a given day as compared to more arid habitats. But what's really interesting about humidity is that humidity is so variable within our environment and within especially the natural environment and forested habitats, which leads to the creation of these microclimates. And so this leads to the spatial variability and the impact of humidity on tick populations. And this is also one of the reasons we see tick populations vary greatly, even within a small section of a trail that is known to, for example, that has tick activity on it. Next, we have precipitation. So increased precipitation can decrease tick activity levels because it slows down nymph development. However, some climate predictions are showing that precipitation can actually facilitate the establishment of endemic tick populations. So this is really an area where we need to additional research to better understand the total impact of precipitation on tick populations. And then lastly, extreme weather events such as flooding and droughts can decrease tick populations through mortality, reduction in host-seeking behavior, and or limiting availability of animal hosts. For example, flooding can cover tick habitats with silt, while temperatures over 30 degrees Celsius can cause ticks to reduce summer activity levels. One thing I will note about this, temperatures above 30 degrees Celsius causing a reduction in tick activity, is that that's temporary. And when the temperatures begin to go down, what we see is an increased activity of increased tick activity again. So this often just changes the seasonality of tick activity into the fall and winter. And so another poll question for you: of the climate variables, which do you think is the most important predictor of tick population establishment? And a reminder that the climate variables are temperature, humidity, precipitation, and extreme weather events. For another minute for people to answer. And absolutely. So temperature is 76% correctly identified. The temperature is the primary contributor to establishing tick populations in new environments. The other thing that these climate variables do is that they can have indirect influences on tick populations. And so when we look at the indirect influences, what we see is that the combination of these climatic variables can change host population availability and abundance, as well as alter the predator-prey dynamics. And this is directly linked to where ticks end up. So for example, the white-tailed deer, which is a known host for tick species, has been predominantly concentrated along the southern border of Canada, but over the next 50 years is expected to increase its range 100 kilometers further north into the Albertan boreal forest along the river corridors. And so this is an example of where ticks would hitch a ride on these deer and end up in new environments. Also, the other thing these climatic variables can do is they can lead to land use changes. So flooding, for example, can change land use patterns and change how we interact with some of these environments, as well as the combination of these variables can lead to changes in human behavior. So, for example, where you might recreate, when you might recreate, and for example, when you might have picnics or spend time in the forest. But the thing we know is that the true impact of climate change is hard to determine because there are so many permutations of both scale and context-dependent variables that are impacted by these specific microhabitats. But we know that these direct factors influence tick populations as well as the indirect factors. And moving on, looking at land use, we know that land use changes in urban, suburban, and rural areas can increase suitable tick habitats. And this is done through a couple of different factors. So primarily, we see rapid housing development in forested area occurring. And what happens here is you create a network of forest patches. So these small little patches of forests. And these small patches can provide ecological connectivity to nearby natural habitats, which actually facilitates animal host and tick movement. These developments also increase ecotones. So again, that transition area between a forested area and a non-forested area where people normally recreate, and it puts more people into these transition zones where you might be exposed to ticks. We then have landscaping and playgrounds, and how you design your landscapes and your gardens and your playgrounds can either increase or decrease suitable tick habitats. And we'll talk more about this and the principles in a few minutes. And lastly, we have green spaces. And in recent years, there's been a push to increase green spaces, pollinator gardens, and movements towards rewilding. And such initiatives are so important for pollinators, for ecosystem services, conservation efforts, and they really support public health efforts to encourage time in nature and cardiovascular exercise. But these initiatives can either increase or decrease the risk of tick encounters. And this is really a relationship that's not well understood. It's likely nonlinear and interconnected. And this really highlights the importance of an interdisciplinary One Health approach to examining the problem and environmental health issues. And then the last landscape factor we want to consider is forest fragmentation. And this is the change of a natural continuous forest into smaller sections, either due to human development and or urbanization. And what forest fragmentation does is it really just changes how things move, and it just changes the biodiversity and the dynamics. And it's actually one of the biggest contributing factors to why we see tick populations expanding in their range. And the first thing that it does is it increases the density of deer populations. We know that deer benefit from edge habitats created by forest fragmentation, and that's primarily due to an absence of predators and winter foraging opportunities. It's just easier for them to live in these edge habitats. The second is forest fragmentation reduces species biodiversity, and this leads to habitat loss and thereby reducing species diversity. And in turn, what it does is it increases white-footed mice populations. And the white-footed mice is a dominant host species in small forest patches, and it's a very competent reservoir for tick-borne pathogens. And so this is really contributing to not only establishment of tick populations, but ticks also being positive for pathogens. And then lastly, what we see is that forest fragmentation increases the potential for human exposure to ticks, again, through those ecotones, those edge habitats between forested and non-forested areas. And so the combination of climate change, land use change, and forest fragmentation is leading to an increase in suitable tick habitats and a range expansion of approximately 35 to 55 kilometers per year. And so this is quite significant when you think about it over 2 to 5 years and how far ticks can migrate northwards. And then moving on to the last evidence review, looking at environmental management strategies to reduce tick populations. This was a synthesis of 106 literature sources. And what we really know here is that up to this point, we know that ticks can be found in many environments across urban, suburban, and recreational areas. And we know one of the common challenges is that many visitors to parks, recreational areas are actually not from that geographical area and potentially unfamiliar with the risk. So the question becomes, how do we best manage ticks in outdoor environments across scales to limit tick-related risks? And using an integrated pest management approach, we've come up with a set of principles using insecticides as a last resort. So here are 9 principles that will help that you can consider in design principles as well as management that will help to reduce tick habitats and animal host habitats. So the first is to clear a clear pathway. So using hardscaping materials such as gravel, stones, sawdust, bare soil, or wood chips, and that's because ticks don't like that feeling on their and so they don't go on those surfaces. The second is you can select plants to limit deer and or rodents, and these are the animal hosts that would be carrying the ticks. And so this helps to prevent ticks from establishing in an area. And these plants can include lavender, rosemary, daffodil, iris, Russian sage. One thing I will note here is that these plants and their success will vary greatly based on the biogeoclimatic zone you're in across Canada. So I really encourage you to talk to a landscape specialist or do some research to see what works for your biogeoclimatic zone. The third is to increase sun exposure and decrease humidity. And this can decrease tick survival rates because ticks would be prone to becoming desiccated and dying. The fourth is to use fencing where possible to limit animal host movement through a landscape. If the hosts don't come in, the ticks don't drop off, therefore limiting tick populations in a particular area. The next few, pruning plants, maintaining lawn, removing yard waste, and stacking wood neatly, are all about minimizing suitable habitats for both the ticks as well as small animal hosts. And then the last thing you can do is move seeding and place structures into open areas and away from the perimeter, and ideally along a hardscaping material so that you minimize your risk even further. And of course, insecticides can be used as a last resort. They can be effective if sprayed at certain intervals and at certain times. But again, this is something that is dependent on a specific landscape. And I would encourage you to talk to a certified pest management specialist to see if your particular outdoor environment is a good candidate for that or not. And one thing I want to highlight here is this idea of competing health priorities. So with the heat domes and heat waves that we're experiencing, there's been a big push for increasing shade and shaded habitats. And what this does is it could inadvertently increase tick habitats, especially in places where individuals might go to seek shade to escape the heat. They may be inadvertently exposed to ticks in this instance. So I'm going to ask you another question. In your personal or professional life, do you foresee yourself implementing the design considerations to reduce the risk of ticks? Wonderful. So just about 90% see themselves using one of these techniques, which is wonderful to see. And these are, in my opinion, these are relatively low stakes, easy to do and kind of get into the habit of doing. And they do make a big difference in terms of limiting your risk of ticks. So what do we do now? So what can we do? And so we can design and manage outdoor environments to minimize risk. And 90%, you guys are almost all on board, which is so fantastic. We can also support and fund research and surveillance efforts at federal, provincial, territorial levels. And the research really, we need to support research that's Canada specific. And so, for example, one thing that would be amazing is to have research on the biology specific to Canada, tick biology and habitat preferences specific to Canada, and to see what's actually happening across the Canadian landscape. We can support policies and land use practices that minimize tick-related risks. So thinking really carefully through what are we approving at municipal levels and how is that impacting our relationship with the environment and increasing our risk or decreasing our risk. And of course, we can communicate the risk across populations to increase awareness to individuals and know what to look for. And this is paramount regardless of everything else, because this allows individuals to be empowered to know what to look for, to know how to best manage their environment and what to do in the event of a tick bite. And when we look at risk communication practices, we see there's several innovative approaches that are already developed. And I'm just going to give you a few examples here. So one is TikTok, which is an online cartoon aimed at educating 5 to 10-year-olds on the prevention and seasonality of ticks, which was led by Dr. Anne-Marie Nickel, based out of SFU and the National Collaborating Center for Mental Health, as well as the BC Centre for Disease Control. And this curriculum includes a child-friendly brochure for additional lessons and activities for children to participate in, and resources for summer camps, which are held outside. So this is great to be able to integrate it into schools and into camps, so children are aware of what ticks may look like and what to do if they find one, as they are one of the populations most likely to be exposed. There's another project based out of the United States called Spray Safe, Play Safe. And this is based on story films aimed at educating homeowners about residential tick management strategies, including personal measures as well as spraying insecticides. And the research on this set of videos showed that participants showed greater confidence after watching these videos and knew what to do about ticks and felt informed. There's also applications for your smartphone, and one of the benefit of these phone-based applications is the ease with which one can access them, the caveat being that not all apps are created equally and not all provide reliable information, so obviously the sources should always be examined. Just to give you a few examples, the Tick app was created in the United States at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and it was found that the greatest benefit of the application was allowing individuals to submit photos to have them identified, to identify the tick in the photo. Another example is the Dutch app called Tek and Beat, and this is an app that allows users to submit ticks, but also to informs users on how to check for ticks and how to remove ticks, and is also connected to tick activity levels in the Netherlands. And so this also showed that users felt more confident and felt more informed about preventative behaviors. There's also a growing interest in the role AI may have in identifying photos that are submitted. So being able to inform AI and have them identify tick species through photo submissions. And there's also some work being done into developing video games for smaller children to educate them on ticks and what to do about them. And then there's also online platforms such as eTick and eNaturalist that can help individuals submit information and get information. This also is really great because it can support public health efforts with real-time information. So eTick allows you to submit a photo with a date and a location for a no-cost identification by a professional, and then provides real-time data. And so this is really a low-cost effort at engaging citizens to be active in their own health and in their own environment, but also supporting public health. And just to give you an example of what an eTick map looks like, I pulled this up today, and this is tick submissions across Canada between January 1st and today. And what you see, those numbers reflect how many ticks have been submitted. So we see more ticks submitted in Southern Ontario, and then you can kind of see what's happening across the rest of Canada. What I will note here is that tick submissions are not reflective of the actual number of ticks in an environment, because you obviously have to know about this website and you have to take the time to take a photo and then submit the tick and or even find the tick. We know many people don't even realize they've had a tick bite. And then there's also the caveat that where the pinpoint is for these locations is where you submit it and not necessarily where the tick bite or tick exposure may have occurred. And it's not a reflection of tick-borne infections because it's just tick photos. It's not an actual analysis of the tick. But having said that, it's an excellent proxy for what is happening across Canada in terms of tick activity at any given time. And then there's also signage. We know that public signs can be effective, but there's mixed reports about it, and the research is limited. And so it's really thinking through how can we create effective signs to increase awareness. But from a public health perspective, it's a low-cost effort to reduce tick bites and tick-borne infections. And so it's worth thinking about how do we create effective signs that increase awareness. And so all this to say, where do we go from here and what have we done? Well, we've created this design document, which is meant to be an easy reference resource that summarizes the information I presented and really thinks about how best to design and manage outdoor environments to reduce tick and animal host habitats. And it's intended for park professionals, recreational professionals, as well as landscape designers, residential property owners, as well as any user of the outdoor environment. So I encourage you all to download it. The short URL is there. I believe Kelsey will put the link in the chats, and I encourage you to download it, to engage with it, to share it. It's meant to be used either online in an online format. It can also be printed out and posted. So it was aimed with this versatility in mind. And so the first page is just the fast facts, thinking about ticks in a changing environment. The second page looks at the tick life cycle and tick species and habitats, so kind of providing the background information in case someone doesn't know anything about ticks. The third page shares the landscape design considerations that I shared, as well as a visual of how that might play out in an environment. And then the last page is really thinking about how you as an individual, what you can do to minimize your own risk further through actions outdoors, indoors, insect repellents, and being a citizen scientist. So to end, I'm going to end with the fast facts as a summary. So ticks can be found in many environments across Canada. Ticks can infect humans with pathogens that can lead to illness. The number of places where ticks can survive and thrive in Canada is growing. And this is due to a combination of climate change, animal migration, deforestation, and urbanization through land use changes. And lastly, and most importantly, landscapes can be designed and managed to minimize tick and animal hosts and habitats. So I'm going to, before I open it up for questions, I'd like to thank my colleagues at the National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health, especially Dr. Leah Rosenkrantz. She's been my go-to person, as well as Drs. Anne-Marie Nickel, Dr. Lydia Ma, and Dr. Sarah Henderson, and Michelle Weens for her library support. And with that, I will open it up for questions. Thank you so much.